Imagine your family, your history, your identity, being reduced to fractions on a piece of paper. 1/2, 1/4, 1/8 sounds strange. That's exactly what happened to Native Americans over a century ago, and it's a story that still haunts today. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the US government created the Dawes Rolls, a system meant to define who was officially Native American. It sounds simple: enroll, provide proof, get recognition. But the reality was far more complicated and often cruel. Identity, culture, and kinship, things that had been defined for generations through family ties, language, and community, were suddenly measured by blood percentages. Literally, your worth as a Native person could be written as a fraction on a government ledger. Half-blood, quarter-blood, eighth. And anything less often meant being denied rights, land, or even recognition by your own community. This wasn't just paperwork. It was a tool of control. Families were forced to navigate a system that ignored history, ignored language, ignored who they were as people. Children grew up knowing their identity might not be enough in the eyes of the government. Tribal lands were divided and sold. Communities fractured, and the consequences echo to this day, as many tribes still wrestle with the question, who counts as Native? Fast forward to today, and the story has only gotten more complicated. DNA tests promise clarity, but they often fail to capture what communities have always known. Identity is not just genetics, it's culture, responsibility, and belonging. Modern enrollment systems still rely on the same logic as the Dawes Rolls, meaning centuries of history can be dismissed in a single form. A number, a percentage, a line in a ledger. Math class may have taught you fractions, but for Native Americans, fractions once defined whether you were recognized as human in the eyes of a government that refused to see your full story. And that's a lesson in history that's as uncomfortable as it is necessary. So stick around. We'll uncover why these numbers mattered, how families fought back, and what it really means to claim an identity that cannot be measured. And hey, if you love stories that make your brain work without falling asleep, hit that subscribe button. Don't worry, I won't quiz you. Yet. In the late 1800s, the United States was expanding westward, and Native nations stood in the path of that expansion. What followed was not just military conflict, it was administrative control. Through policies like the General Allotment Act of 1887, commonly known as the Dawes Act, the federal government introduced a system that would permanently alter how Native identity was defined. The idea sounded bureaucratic, even technical. Divide tribal lands into individual allotments, assign parcels to Native households, and open the surplus land to non-native settlers. But to divide land, the government first needed to decide who legally qualified as Native. That decision was documented through enrollment records known as the Dawes Rolls. On paper, it was record-keeping. In practice, it was a reduction. Federal agents traveled through Native territories compiling names, ages, family connections, and blood quantum. Officials assigned fractions to individuals based on their recorded ancestry: 1/2, 1/4, 1/8. These numbers were not rooted in how tribes traditionally defined belonging. For generations, native nations recognized identity through kinship systems, shared responsibility, language, adoption, and community acknowledgement. Identity was relational, not mathematical, but the federal system replaced community recognition with arithmetic. If your blood quantum fell below a certain threshold, you could lose legal recognition. Land rights, treaty protections, access to tribal resources. Over time, as generations married across communities, the fractions naturally decreased. Children who grew up in native culture, spoke the language, and lived within the community could find themselves classified as less native on paper than their grandparents. The math was quiet, but the consequences were loud. This was not accidental. Fractional classification made it easier for the federal government to shrink the number of legally recognized native citizens over time. Fewer recognized citizens meant fewer treaty obligations, less land held in trust, less political leverage for native nations. And so identity, something once grounded in living relationships, became something measured in ink. When you look at those old enrollment forms today, the columns of names and fractions seem sterile. But behind every fraction was a family, a grandmother, a child, a community navigating a system that did not ask who they were, it calculated them. That was the beginning of fractional identity. Not a cultural tradition, a federal formula. By the turn of the 20th century, enrollment on the Dawes rolls became the gateway to legal native identity in Indian territory. Between 1898 and 1914, federal agents working under the Dawes Commission determined who would be officially recognized as citizens of the so-called 5 civilized tribes: the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek-Muskogee, and Seminole nations. On the surface, the process looked administrative. Individuals applied, testified about family ties, and waited for approval. But the system operated under federal definitions, not tribal ones. Some people were included after interviews and documentation. Others were rejected for inconsistent records, absence during registration periods, or simple clerical judgment. Entire families who shared homes, language, and community life could receive different classifications or none at all. The consequences were permanent. Enrollment determined eligibility for land allotments under the Dawes Act. Those listed on the rolls received parcels. Those excluded did not. In some cases, siblings were recorded differently. One might be enrolled as by blood, another categorized as freedmen, another left off entirely. A single pen stroke could redraw a family tree. Blood quantum, the calculation of Indian blood expressed as fractions, tightened the boundaries even further. Although not always applied uniformly during the original Dawes enrollment, blood quantum later became embedded in federal and some tribal policies. Over generations, as families intermarried, those fractions decreased on paper. 1/2 became 1/4. 1/4 became 1/8. The math moved in only one direction. Ticking clock. Fading heartbeat. The system didn't measure language fluency. It didn't measure cultural responsibility or community participation. It measured ancestry as recorded by federal officials at a specific historical moment. And those records became the foundation for modern enrollment criteria in many tribes. It's tempting to treat this as distant history. But for many families today, proving descent from an ancestor listed on the door's rolls remains essential for recognition. If your ancestor wasn't recorded or was misclassified, you may still feel that exclusion generations later. Turns out math isn't just cruel in exams, it can reshape land ownership, citizenship, and legacy. What happened under the Dawes Commission wasn't simply paperwork. It was a restructuring of identity through law. Families who lived together for generations found themselves divided by ink. Culture remained alive in the community, but on paper, fractions carried more weight than belonging. Fast forward a century. The ink has dried on the old ledgers, but the question hasn't disappeared. Who counts? Today, identity is often verified through paperwork and genetic testing. Tribal enrollment offices still rely heavily on documented lineage, usually tracing ancestry back to names recorded on the door's rolls. If you cannot prove direct descent from someone listed, recognition may be denied, regardless of how deeply rooted your cultural life is within the community. But now there's a modern twist: DNA testing. Commercial genetic tests promise to break identity into percentages mapped across continents. A male saliva sample returns with charts, regions, and data points. It feels scientific, objective, final. But DNA tests cannot name your tribe. They cannot confirm citizenship within a sovereign native nation. At best, they estimate genetic markers linked broadly to indigenous populations in the Americas. That is not the same as belonging to a living political and cultural community. Tribal nations are sovereign governments. Citizenship is a legal and communal matter, not simply a genetic one. Many tribes set their own criteria. Some use blood quantum, others require documented descent, and some combine multiple standards. The authority rests with the tribe, not a laboratory, and yet bureaucracy has expanded. Federal recognition processes, enrollment applications, documentation requirements, birth certificates, census cards, affidavits have created a system where identity must be proven through paper trails that stretch back generations. For families whose ancestors were excluded, misclassified, or avoided enrollment out of distrust, that paper trail may not exist. Meanwhile, culture continues outside the forms. Elders pass down language. Ceremonies continue. Community responsibilities are taught face to face, not test tube to test tube. A pipette can measure genetic markers, but it cannot measure kinship obligations, shared memory, or lived participation in a nation's life. This is where the tension lives, between biological ancestry and political citizenship, between data and belonging. DNA changed the conversation. Bureaucracy formalized it, but neither replaced the deeper foundations of native identity, community recognition, shared history, and sovereignty. The tools may look modern: glowing charts, digital records, online portals, but the underlying question remains old and unresolved. Can identity be reduced to numbers, whether written in ink or coded in genes? Because culture didn't begin in a filing cabinet, and it doesn't live in a laboratory report. By this point, it's easy to talk about policies, percentages, and paperwork. But behind every fraction was a person. Behind every enrollment decision was a family. This wasn't just numbers. When federal policies like the Dawes Act reshaped native citizenship through the Dawes rolls, the consequences didn't end with land allotments. They moved quietly through generations. A name missing from a roll in 1902 could still affect a great-grandchild in 2026. Families who lived together, practiced ceremony together, and buried their ancestors in the same ground sometimes discovered years later that they were not equally recognized on paper. One sibling enrolled, another excluded. One branch documented, another erased by clerical error, mistrust of federal agents, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Imagine explaining to your children that your grandmother was native. Your community knows it. Your history proves it, but the record does not. Elders have spent decades gathering documents, birth certificates, affidavits, census cards, testimony from relatives long gone. Not to rediscover who they are, but to prove it to institutions. For many, the process feels less like enrollment and more like appeal. An appeal for acknowledgement, an appeal for continuity. And when recognition is denied, the impact isn't symbolic. It can mean loss of access to services, cultural programs, political participation within tribal governance, even burial rights in some cases. Recognition affects lived reality. Yet culture has persisted. Despite shifting legal definitions, communities maintained language, ceremony, and kinship systems. Elders continued teaching. Families continued gathering. Identity survived outside the file cabinets, even when it was questioned inside them. This is the human cost, generations carrying both pride and paperwork. The emotional weight of knowing who you are and knowing that a government once tried to define that for you. Slow zoom on an elder's eyes. In those eyes are stories older than enrollment cards, older than federal law, older than fractions. The policies measured blood, the bureaucracy measured dissent. But neither could fully measure belonging. And that's the quiet truth running through this history. Identity reduced on paper can still live powerfully in people.